Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here with a new video, and welcome to the final episode of the Underdogs of Raiding. Today we're going back to a class that I'm very familiar with, and we're going to check out its feral counterpart. Yep, in this episode of the Underdogs of Raiding we're taking a look at the feral DPS Druid. So as always, let's go back to 2004 where we find ourselves at the beginning stage of Vanilla WoW. In this era of the game, feral was quite popular as it was kind of the go-to way to level up. Sure, you could level up as balanced druid as well, but that was much slower as feral druids had much less downtime due to them using energy for their attacks and sometimes mana when they had to get out of cat form and heal themselves. For anyone who started playing WoW at a much later stage, let's say Mists of Pandaria or Warlords of Draenor, it is interesting to know that cat form was required at level 20. So when you reached level 10 and you could finally choose your talents and you chose feral, you first had to level the 10 remaining levels in bear form, which in vanilla went really slow, as you were basically leveling as a poor man's warrior. Speaking of talents, let's have a look at the talent tree from the early days of vanilla WoW, because man, is it ever something to behold. So, here it is, and there's a lot of things I want to go over. First of all, the talent Sharpened Claws. In the later stages of the game, you only had to smack 3 points in this talent to get 6% crit. Here, it's 5 points for 5% crit. Same with Blood Frenzy, which required 5 points for the 100% chance, rather than the 2 points in the later stage of the game. Predatory Strike was also quite different. It required 5 points for the full talent, and it gave you 20% attack power bonus on your cat form abilities. Next up, we have separate talents for Fairy Fire. Yes, we have one for bear form, and one for cat form. Then we have Feline Swiftness, which is much later down the talent tree, and while it does only need 1 point for the extra 30% speed in cat form, it doesn't give you 4% dodge. Then we have the talent Strength of the Wild, not Heart of the Wild, which only benefited bear form and cat form and gave you 12% strength. And then we're left with 3 talent points that a lot of people probably have never seen before. Improved Ravage gave you 10% extra crit chance on your Ravage ability. Primal Instinct gave you 25% reduced mana cost for shapeshifting, and Improved Pounce for a 100% chance to give you an additional combo point if you smack 2 talent points in there. So wait, if we have Primal Instinct for reduced mana cost for shapeshifting, does that mean we can combine that with the talent Natural Shapeshifter in the balance tree? Well, no. While the icon may be the same, it's a completely different talent called Swift Shifting, which reduced the delay before using spells and abilities by 1.5 seconds. So while you could instantly cast spells on a 1.12 version of vanilla, back then you needed to wait a global cooldown to cast any spells unless you got this talent. Oh, by the way, no Omen of Clarity for feral DPS druids, as this version only gave you a free spell. It didn't count for any abilities in bear or cat form. One last thing I want to talk about is the resto tree, because Furor in this stage in the game will only benefit bear form with extra rage, not cat form. That is a separate talent that is later down the tree called Intensity, which, like the later version of Furor, gives you 100% chance to gain 40 energy when you shapeshift into cat form. This talent tree made feral druids quite interesting to say the least, and while they were still decent enough while leveling, they had some troubles in level 60 content. So, what were these problems? Well, it all boils down to DPS. You see, druids have always been a jack of all trades, but a master of none. Same goes for balanced druid. They're not completely terrible, it's just that the equivalent mage, or in this case the equivalent rogue, will simply do more DPS. And that's really the biggest struggle druids had who tried to compete with the other DPSers in cat form. They just couldn't keep up with their basic rotations. But this was all in a very early stage of the game, when there was not a whole lot of information regarding the feral druids, and sooner or later people would really start tapping into the full potential of the feral druid. Which brings us to the later stage of the game, and this is where things start to get interesting. So let's first brush over the talent tree druids had to play with. First of all, we got natural weapons for 10% extra physical damage, which was a nice boost for the feral DPS druids, and on top of that we now have a version of Omen of Clarity that also works for abilities in cat form. Next up we have Furor in the resto tree, which now works for both bear form and cat form, so no separate talents anymore and having to spend a boatload more talents in the resto tree to benefit from this. And then we get to the meat and potatoes of the spec, the feral tree. Feral Aggression not only reduced attack power from Demoralizing Roar, it also focuses on increasing damage for a Ferocious Bite, which will definitely come in handy. Talents like Sharpened Claws and Blood Frenzy were reworked, so now they cost less talent points to get, and we mercifully have one Fairy Fire talent for Bear form and Cat form. Then we have an upgraded version of Heart of the Wild, which instead of just giving you 12% strength in Cat form and Bear form, now gives you 20% intellect, 20% stamina in Bear form, and 20% strength in Cat form. And last but not least, we have the top talent Leader of the Pack, which gave you and everyone else in your party an extra 3% crit to all ranged and melee abilities. Just looking at the talent trees, you can see how drastically druids were changed in just one version of the game. And with these new talents and some other changes to the druid class, people really started to figure out just how powerful feral DPS could be. So how are druids in this stage of the game? Well, I'd like to split this up in two parts. One being the retail vanilla days and one being vanilla on private servers today. You see, despite the new talents, druids still had a negative stigma attached to the balance and feral tree. Back then they were considered not viable for any sort of PvE use, and it meant that almost every druid was forced to go restoration if you wanted to get into a raiding guild. One of the reasons why it was not viable back then is because we just didn't know a whole lot about feral DPS compared to what we know now, and let me tell you, what we knew back then pales in comparison to the vast amount of knowledge that people on private servers gathered about doing feral DPS. One of those people that really contributed to this is ShedotheDruid, who is also our featured guest for this episode, and he'll tell us more about the feral druid in today's vanilla private servers. So, without further ado, take it away, Shedo.
Hey, I'm Shedo, a tryhard classic feral cat player and a theory crafter. I played Druid as main character from already 2005 until this day. Also raided all vanilla content through as a feral cat DPS just recently. Created also a cat DPS simulation sheet that allows you to compare gear, analyze stat weights and estimate DPS with different buffs, enchants, gear, boss debuffs, etc. So feral cats in vanilla have in general been considered useless, and druids were pretty much always forced to heal back in the day. Well, I think that's completely understandable, as so many things were still a mystery, undiscovered or misinterpreted. For example, during vanilla era, no one thought about power shifting, and since power shifting wasn't invented, so wasn't the power of the level 40 blue item Wolf's Head Helm understood. Alright, well, what is power shifting, by the way? To put it simple, you shift out of cat form and back into cat form instantly just before an energy tick to gain 80 energy. Then you use a shred, gain another energy tick, use another shred, and power shift again. Optimally, this would give you 100 energy once every 4 seconds and allows you to cast 2 shreds and of course Ferocious Bite when you're at 5 combo points. If there's lag, then you may miss the energy tick, and that's a pretty big DPS loss as it delays your next power shift by 2 seconds again. One of the major or the biggest recent discoveries for feral DPS were the manual crowd pummelers, which are level 29 weapons dropping from an optional boss in Gnome Regan. This weapon, believe it or not, is even more powerful than AT-Ash, which is the legendary staff from Naxxramas for feral cat. And the reason behind this is that cat does not benefit from weapon damage at all, or weapon speed, and thus weapons are barely stat sticks. So we benefit from only the stats on the weapons. However, what makes Pummeler so powerful, or MCP, as you can abbreviate it, it has an on-use effect that gives you 50% attack speed for 30 seconds per use. It has 3 charges and no cooldown between the charges, so basically you get a 50% haste buff for 1 minute and 30 seconds at a time, after which it's a 30-second downtime if you switch for a fresh pummeler, and then you get the buff again for another 90 seconds. But due to the charges that it has, you will have to farm them for each raid, so that kinda adds a little more extra work for feral cat player to make it competitive. How does Feral Cat do in raids then? I have some pros and cons. Let's go through the pros first. Feral Cat has actually pretty good average DPS in single target fights. It has good damage also in fights that include short, massive AoEs. For example, the Nefarian Phase 3, where you get loads of pretty low HP mobs that spawn. And that's due to Hurricane being completely underrated. It's actually really good in massive AoE, which lasts for about 10 to 15 seconds. And of course you also have sappers like everybody else with the engineering. Another pro is the possibility of, or the adaptability of Feral Cat, because you can turn into a great off-tank that deals really high threat when you're using pummelers. Now, pummelers are really good for feral tanks as well, because most of your threat comes from mauls in bear form, and maul works similarly to heroic strike, so it empowers your next attack. Now, with the pummeler, you get 50% more attacks, so basically you get 50% more mauls in, so that's a huge TPS up. Of course, you bring combat rest to the raid. You're even able to turn into a really good decurse bot or abolish poison bot when needed. For example, on Vescadus, where you don't really do anything with your melee attacks. The rotation is a lot more fun than the other classes, and it's also more challenging because you don't have to only push one button, but you have to keep an eye on the timers all the time, etc. What about cons then? Well, there are no DPS cooldowns, so numbers don't look as good in really short fights. No cleave damage, but it's only single target, and you're gonna need a lot of consumables for competitive raiding. So basically the melee consumes, plus mana pots, runes, and pummelers, etc. And when the fight duration is longer than 3 minutes, so basically next Ramas, you will experience some downtime to power shifting, because you will run out of mana after 3 minutes usually, unless you're on Alliance, where you have Judgment of Wisdom on the boss. That allows you to power shift almost infinitely. My experience when I raided all the content through, during MC and Black Hole Lair, you can beat every caster as well as hunters on most of the bosses, and in pure single target fights you can even compete with rogues and warriors. In Zul'Gurd and AQ patches, casters gain a lot of spell hit, so that increases their damage, but personally I was able to compete even in AQ really well against others. Just depends a bit on the boss mechanics, so which boss we're talking about. In Next Ramas, well, that's where the fights get really long and other classes get a lot more gear ups compared to Feral. There are only a couple of drops that you want as a Feral from Next Ramas. So there, Feral might drop a little in the comparison, especially when talking about the farm raids where people already have the Next gear. But there are also there are fights where Feral can excel. On average, talking about all the content, my DPS ended up usually between I was usually between 5th to 10th in the DPS, but in various occasions I was able to reach even to top 3, and a couple of times even the first position. Personally, I think the advantage of having a Feral in raids is getting a really good single target DPS that has the ability to adapt to so many different things when needed, like off-tanking, decursing, abolish poison bot, even, for example, Loa Theb in Next Ramas being part of the healing rotation, so throwing once per minute a max rank healing touch on the tank, while you're bringing combat rest to the raid as well. Well, that's pretty much it.
And thank you, Shedo, for that comprehensive view of the Feral Druid on today's vanilla private service. I think it's fair to say that the difference between retail vanilla and today's vanilla for the Feral DPS Druid is night and day. We've come to understand so much more about them and figure out some very quirky features about the class, including that Wolf's Head helmet, which turns out to be better than anything you get your hands on, as well as the manual crowd pummeler. I mean, who would have thought that a random blue from Nomergon would be better for Feral Druids than the actual legendary Staff of Atiash? Barely anyone in retail sure did, but with all these features, it has been proven that Feral Druid, if played well, can be a very powerful DPS class. But like the Balanced Druid, you will have to go the extra mile with consumables to keep up. So now let's move on to the Burning Crusade era of the game. In this era, we find this talent tree for the Druids. A few talents I want to point out here are Leader of the Pack and Improved Leader of the Pack. You see, a nice party buff that Druids gave the melees in Vanilla was Leader of the Pack, where it gave them 3% extra melee crit chance. In the Burning Crusade though, Leader of the Pack, with improved talent points, gave you 5% extra melee crit chance, and if they land a critical strike, they will be healed for 4% of their total health. So now it's both a great offensive and defensive buff that melees will love. Then we have Predatory Instincts, which increases your damage from melee critical strikes by 10% and your chance to AoE attacks by 15%. And last but definitely not least, Feral Druids got a brand new ability called Mangle. As soon as you would get Mangle, you would replace this with Rip, your standard Sinister Strike kind of move. Except not only did this do direct damage, it would also increase your damage from bleed effects while Mangle was active on the target. This was a nice DPS increase, as the main finishing move you would use while doing DPS was Rip. A finishing move that would not cause instant damage, but a large portion of damage over time. So Feral Druid's rotation was rather simple. You open up with Mangle, use Shred until you have 5 combo points, and use Rip whenever you get enough combo points. Naturally, Fury was still a thing in the Burning Crusade, so power shifting to get extra energy back was also a very crucial part of doing as much DPS as you can. So how did things fare for the Feral Druid in the Burning Crusade? Well, for starters, it was much easier obtaining gear, since you now had separate specializations for tier 4, and the fact that there were a lot more items to gain from reputation and questing, so that's definitely nice. That being said though, in the beginning stages, Feral Druids definitely struggled to keep up with the other classes that weren't so gear dependent. While an Elemental Shaman or a Fire Mage could do a nice chunk of DPS in greens and a few blues, Druids had a hard time keeping up. Now this did get better once you were rocking some full heroic gear, and if you had your power shifting under control, you could give a lot of DPSers a run for their money, even in raids. However, it has to be said that they were never on top of the DPS meters. Those were still dominated by Destro Warlocks, Fire Mages and more. Unfortunately, seeing a Feral Druid in the top 10 of the damage meters was a rare sight, though some managed to pull it off, including Namaste from Hellground. I mean, doing about 2800 DPS on average as a Feral Druid is nothing short of amazing, and it really shows that if you know what you're doing, you are able to pull your own weight just fine. I guess that's what it boils down to. Feral Druids were never the king of DPS in the Burning Crusade, but if you mastered your rotation, you were able to be a valuable DPS spot in raid. Oh, by the way, one more thing to notice is that even though the Wolf's Head helmet is a level 40 item from an older version of the game, it's still very relevant to any Feral DPS Druid in the Burning Crusade, simply because the energy gained back from this helm makes up for the stats you would be missing out on if you would wear a regular headpiece. Just wanted to point that out before we move on, as it was quite interesting seeing Feral Druids decked out in epic gear, but still wearing the level 40 blue item from Vanilla WoW. And now we end up at the Wrath of the Lich King era of the game, where Druids had this talent tree to mess around with. So there's a few things I want to point out here, including King of the Jungle, which would instantly restore 60 energy every time you use Tiger Fury. Oh, by the way, it is important to note that Tiger's Fury was reworked in Wrath of the Lich King. Before this expansion, it would cost you energy to use it, which meant any proper Feral Druid would never use this in a rotation. It was just considered a waste of energy, but now Tiger's Fury required 0 energy, and on top of that would regenerate 60 energy with these 3 talents, so it became a must-have in any Feral Druid's rotation. Another interesting talent is Primal Gore, which now allowed the dot damage from Lacerate and more importantly Rip to critically hit. Another big change, as Rip was in this expansion still one of the go-to finishing moves for Feral Druids. And last but definitely not least, we have the last talent point in this tree, Berserk. It allowed Mangle to hit 3 targets and have no cooldown in bear form, but more importantly, it reduced the energy cost from all your abilities in cat form by 50%. So in a way, this was a Druid's adrenaline rush, and it was a huge DPS boost for when you could go wild with damage and not worry about threat. One last ability I want to talk about is a new finishing move that Druids got in the Wrath of the Lich King, which was Savage Roar. This finishing move increased the physical damage done by 30%, and with every combo point the buff would last longer. This was another must-have skill for a Druid's rotation, as that much extra physical damage was just too good to skip. So how did things go for the Feral Druid in this expansion? Well, Feral Druids were actually quite powerful in this expansion, giving many classes a good run for the money once you get that rotation down. I unfortunately never got around to doing, let's say, ICC 25 man with a Feral Druid, but from what I could gather and the footage I saw, Feral Druids were always quite high on the DPS list. Unfortunately, Feral Druid still had a rough time beating a well-geared Fury Warrior, who, with the Tonka Trinket and Shadowmourne, could pull insane numbers that a Feral Druid just couldn't keep up with. But I'd like to not end this episode on a sour note, because look at how far the Feral Druid has gotten. From a spec people thought was only good for leveling, to a worthy competitor on the DPS list, and, just to add to the list, also a very competent tank if played well. While being the melee counterpart of the Druid, and me being more of a ranged spell DPS type of Druid, it still holds a very special place in my heart, and I'm sure I'm not alone on this. From being a simple leveling spec, to a spec that was laughed at in in-game content, to a spec that with enough research has been proven to work quite well. A spec that was expanded on in the later versions of World of Warcraft, and is now one to be respected and to look out for on the damage meters. To all the Feral Druids out there, I thank you for showing other DPSers we're not a joke. We're here to give you a good run for your money, and we're here to keep on shredding. And with that, we are at the end of this episode and also this series. What a ride it has been, and what interesting specs we looked at. From Smite Priest to Protection Paladins, all had a very special story, and all of them deserve their own episode. It's been a blast making these videos, and I want to give a huge thanks to everyone who collaborated with me on these videos. I'll be back very soon with a brand new video series I'm working on, but for now, I want to thank you for watching this video. I'm Hamsterwheel, and have a good one.